When I put out a couple of months back to see what episode people wanted to see us do for our first sequel, it's fair to say things didn't quite go as planned. I had already put some ideas down on paper for where we might see the Atlanteans pop up, or what might happen to the survivors of the 551st in the wake of the Wendigo attack. Those two episodes, Malediction and Mendacious, were far and away the best that we'd received in terms of feedback. So to me, I just assumed they'd be bankers for our first sequel. So what happens? Everybody says they want to know what happened to the UFO after the attack on Pengamoors, which is bloody typical because out of any of the sequels I could have thought up with, that's the one I'd put the least planning and effort into. That said, the UFO story was always destined to be part of a trilogy. There is a final instalment, and it is fairly set in stone. It is my plan, though, to hold off on progressing that for as long as I can, to do other sequels and to pursue newer storylines as well. On doing a sequel, I have to say I have found it a little bit challenging. Now we've got different characters, character arcs. Everything has to at least relate to the original episode. And with all the times and dates, not only in real World War II, but in the stories as well, it does become quite difficult trying to marry them up. Who would have thought that the more component pieces you add to an environment, the harder it is to make them fit together? That said, some of you have, but I would hope that there's more and more Easter eggs that you're noticing here and there as the episodes progress now. For part two of the story, there were a couple of things that were important to me to have. And the first one was to parody a trope that I hate that's been done to death, which is a team of British soldiers or spies entering a secret Nazi lab. For once, I wanted to be Britain, that was the country desperate enough to break the laws of humanity to try and win victory, and for it to be Germans creeping through a sinister lab, unable to comprehend the moral depths their enemy have sunk to in order to win the war. It was also important to me for our hero, well, I say hero, it's close as, not to be another form of gentleman spy or super spy. Billy Schmidt isn't James Bond and he's not Ian Fleming. Far from it. He's a street hustler, he's a street brawler, and he's a bit more street smart than the people around him. But only marginally. He still managed to wind himself up in prison, but he is prepared to do things and to justify things to him in order to get where he needs to get in life. I had done some research on German special forces during the war. Pretty much every arm of their military had some form of special forces team that potentially you might not have heard of. But a lot of those weren't active or they weren't formed this early on in the war. And they would have been a bit out of place. I would have had to go a bit rogue to fit them in the storyline, which is why this didn't end up with an epic clash of German and English special forces on the Scottish coast. And it's why the Brandenburg Regiment was perfect for what I needed. The Brandenburgers were formed before the declaration of war, and they were the brainchild of a German intelligence officer named Theodor von Hippel. He'd served during World War One in East Africa, and he'd mobilised a number of native guerrilla bands against the Allied forces there with some success. As Germany prepared for war in 1936, he was still in the army, and he proposed a saboteur arm where all the operatives were trained in clandestine techniques and learned foreign languages. And he was turned down. The army was so confident that they had the technology and the techniques not to need spies at that time. But it was a spy who saw value in it, which was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who was the head of naval intelligence. He was very receptive to the idea and provided space and funding for it. Training for the Brandenburg recruits took between 5 and 7 months. They were actively encouraged to learn different languages to assist with infiltration. The unit was deployed during the invasion of Holland and Poland. They would cross the border a day early, sabotage rail yards, communication systems, and undermine the confidence of the defenders. Despite early successes, they were still looked down on largely by the military. Military officers of that type fitted into two stereotypes. There were the traditionalists and the aristocrats who didn't think sabotage was gentlemanly, and there were the up-and-coming Nazis and high flyers who thought that they just didn't need an edge like that to win battles. It didn't help that a large percentage of Brandenburgers were misfits or criminals, didn't fit in well with other units, and they'd ended up in the Brandenburgers, very much as a last chance saloon. They played a key role during Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. Brandenburg teams crossed the border early, mixed with the Russian units, spread disinformation and chaos, and led to desertions. But as the war shifted and Germany went on the defensive, it was largely felt that special operations were a luxury, not a necessity. The unit was converted into an infantry battalion and found itself on the Eastern Front. Operating under Otto Skorzeny, Germany's most famous commando, the Brandenburgers were unfortunately pretty much wiped out by late 1944. And the truth is their exploits only really came to light in the aftermath of the war, when the survivors started to talk about it. All three of the U-boats which were featured in this episode were real subs, and two of them, the commanders that are named, were their genuine commanders. U-77 was a Type 7 sub, launched in November 1940, and had a pretty long career by U-boat standards. She took part in 11 patrols. She was a part of 6 different wolf packs, and she started out her career in the North Sea before being transferred to the Mediterranean in late 1941. She had 15 confirmed kills to her name when she was surprised on the surface by RAF aircraft off the coast of Cartagena in March 43. Critically wounded, the captain ordered the ship be scuttled, and he and his 47 crew members took to the seas. Sadly, the following morning, when Spanish fishing boats encountered the survivors, there were only 9 still left alive. Heinrich Schonder, who had already won the Knight's Cross, had left the boat the previous year to command U-200. Sadly, he and his crew were again surprised on the surface by aircraft off the coast of Iceland 2 months after U-77 was sunk, and his ship went down with him on board and all hands. U-79, again a Type 7, launched around the same period, and Wolfgang Kaufmann was her one and only commander. She wasn't as lucky as a sister ship. She participated in 6 patrols and 1 wolf pack, and she had 2 confirmed kills. In December of 1941, she was operating out of Salamis when she was encountered by 2 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Hasty and HMS Hotspur. They carried out a depth charge attack for 3.5 hours before Kaufmann made the decision to surface the ship and scuttle it and escape with his crew. They all survived in captivity, and Kaufmann would go on to die in 1963, long after the war. U-21 was a Type 1B and was launched way back in July 1936. At the outbreak of hostilities, she was deployed to the North Sea, where she carried out 6 patrols, sank 6 ships, and her claim to fame was damaging the cruiser HMS Belfast with one of her mines. Unfortunately, due to a navigational error, she was grounded off the coast of Norway in February 1940 during her 7th patrol, and she was interned there by the Norwegian authorities. She was then liberated during the invasion of Norway by Germany, and the decision was made because of her age and the damage to use as a training boat. So she never went out on patrol again, but was used to train a new generation of U-boat officers. In August 1944, she was moored up at Pillau when the decision was made to cannibalise her and use the spare parts for newer subs. and her what was left of her was seized by the Russian army when they invaded. Lothar Gruner, he's entirely fictional. He's in the story purely to try and humanise and counter some stereotypes of U-boat commanders in the media. And the attitudes he's got, I've tried to make representative of U-boat officers at the time that the story is set. RAF Drem was a real base, though its career is a little less dramatic and exciting than in this story. There was an aerodrome there since 1916, and during World War One, it became home to a squadron from the Royal Flying Corps. It was also briefly used as a transit point for an American squadron on its way to France. The base was deactivated during the war between wars. In 1935, it was the scene of a slightly odd incident when an officer who was a clairvoyant visited and claimed he'd seen it reactivated for a coming war. Good as gold. World War II, it's reopened and resurfaced, initially used for a training squadron and then a fighter defence unit for Edinburgh. The station was used to devise an experimental lighting system to help night fighters return to base, and gave its name to that system, the Drem lighting system. This involved putting lights on poles around the airfield, but pointing the beams in a certain way, so the only aircraft that would see where the beams were pointing were aircraft circling to land, rather than enemy aircraft on approach. In 1942, the base was transferred from the RAF to the Royal Navy to operate coastal patrols. And then in May 1945, 3 German transports landed there with the military commanders for Norway on board, and they've been asked to fly to Scotland to surrender their forces in Norway to the British. Drem was decommissioned not long after that and was never opened again afterwards. You might have guessed it from the last testimonial that I did that I'm going to be doing the same thing for Malediction next that I did with Nerthal. There'll be 2 more testimonials hinting at the aftermath of the Wendigo attack in France and where the horror spreads after that. It's America, by the way. This story won't, however, feature old Johnny Greywolf. His future lies down an equally twisted but different path. Anyway, I know I always say it, but I do hope you're still enjoying this. I enjoy making these. I enjoy all the feedback you give me. I'm grateful for all the interaction I have with all of you. And hopefully, I will see you guys again soon.